bin Zayn al-Habashi. We are in his discussion of an obligation, and actually our first obligation, or you could say from it is our first obligation. Talabul ilm farida ala kulli muslim wa muslima. Seeking knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge, is an obligation upon every Muslim and Muslimah. And it proceeded that learning is a personal obligation, meaning every single Muslim that is accountable is personally obliged to learn. So then the question comes, what is it that they are personally obliged to learn? And we discussed that that is in three areas, or you can summarize that in three areas. And we referenced the first of them in our last lesson. One is obliged to learn what is necessary for one's belief to be sound. That's the first area. An obligation in the area of Iman. And that is basically that one knows the obligatory attributes of Allah, His messengers, and transmitted affairs of the unseen, like the events of the grave, the day of resurrection, and so on. So this basic knowledge of tenets of faith, and it's actually, you might say, the easiest thing to learn briefly, and the texts are typically the shortest, provided that one hasn't been influenced by fallacies from heretical sects or from groups of unbelievers. It's quite simple, the discussion of Iman. And we ask Allah to deepen our Iman and Yaqeen. So that's the first. The second area is in al-fiqh, or practical rules of the religion, or you could say in Islamic law. So fiqh, the subject of fiqh, of the practical rules of the religion, are human actions. Right? So that area, and that's most of what this text will cover. So from that area, we are obliged to know what's necessary for our worship to be valid, so that we can worship and perform our obligations in a way that are valid. What does that mean? That means that you don't have to make it up. So if we perform an act of worship that is not valid, if it's an obligation, we are obliged, we're required to make it up. Repeat it in the time, if we know on time, and if we learn afterwards, to make it up. So a work like that is considered invalid. So an example of that would be if we learned after praying that we were not in wudu. Right? That work would be invalid. So learning things like that, that is personally obligatory. How to make your worship sound. And it might sound like, oh, that's too elementary. Imam al-Ghazali, he said, and this is in the 5th century, he said most of the people in towns don't know the conditions of salat, much less villagers or nomads. And that was a time when Islamic knowledge was prevalent. Like, honestly, if you study fiqh, you'll get in the habit of trying to avoid watching people's worship, so you don't have to see all kinds. I've literally ran from mosques at the end of the night to avoid seeing a bunch of people eat after sahur is over, right? Because then that places the obligation upon you to command the good and forbid the wrong, get into stuff with people. So there's a lot of, we got to work at it. We got to work on it. So just in shurut of salah, like just in conditions of prayer, like how to cover entirely, right? Like a big congregation nowadays, some brother's going to bend down and you're going to see his pants line and his t-shirt's going to come up. You're going to see his backside or the bottom of his back. That invalidates the prayer in the view of most of the jurists, for example, right? For example, so what that means is knowledge of these personal obligations as pertain to valid worship is not prevalent enough, right? So then that speaks to another obligation, and that's inviting to Allah. That's why we have the obligation to spread Islamic knowledge. Everybody, please come up, please, to invite to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in practical laws, how our worship will be valid. Secondly, and not everybody's going to do this, right? A lot of the young people, they're already accountable, but they don't have to do these things. If you are going to engage in monetary transactions or marital affairs, you're going to get married. I would assume most of us want to get married. And all of us at some point will buy stuff. If you're still fortunate enough that your parents are buying things instead of you, thank Allah for that. But when you start buying things, we have to know how to execute a valid transaction. Otherwise, what we've acquired may not rightfully belong to us, and the money that was exchanged may not rightfully belong to the merchant. And Sayyidina Umar, he would say, no one may do business in our market except someone who learns the laws, the practical laws of our religion. And then if you're going to marry, same. You have to learn how to execute a legitimate marital agreement and then fulfill the rights of your spouse. That's a personal obligation. If you're going to marry, to learn how to do that. If you're going to do transactions, how to do that. And then thirdly, in the area of our practical rules, one has to know the forbidden things that you might encounter in your environment. We were just talking, who was I talking to? I was just talking to a brother, kids in school. Obligation, for example, we have to teach the young people the prohibition of homosexuality, right? Of gay and lesbian stuff, because they're going to be bombarded by that type of forbidden action. Or gambling, for example, here. Whatever it is, whatever they're going to encounter, whatever a Muslim's going to encounter that's forbidden around them, they have to acquire knowledge of that prohibition. And then some of those may be more prevalent in one place than another. So that's based on one's circumstances. So that's in practical law. How to worship validly, engage in agreements that are valid, and avoid the forbidden things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to avoid. And then a third area of personally obligatory knowledge is knowledge of the forbidden vices, meaning diseases of the heart. Knowledge of diseases of the heart and how to cure them. So for example, and just to make it plain, these things are typically thoughts, right? A thought that occurs in your heart and mind. So a thought that anger that someone acquired something, someone got something that you don't think they deserve, right? Like, for example, someone got a nice car and someone thinks they don't deserve that. What is the name of that thought? Hasad. Hasad. So knowledge that is hasad is obligatory. And knowledge how to rid our hearts of that, at least to the minimum extent that's an obligation, is obligatory. And that's an example. Other thoughts are like the thought of showing off in worship, or a disease of the heart, a riyah, that one does worship intending to impress someone or gain something from them. That is called what? A riyah, showing off in worship, or translated as ostentation. What's the thought? What do we call the thought that a person thinks they're superior to someone else? What do you call that? El-kibr, arrogance. It could be translated pride or arrogance. The Prophet ﷺ defined it. Batur al-haq wa ghamtun nas. To reject the truth and look down on people. So there are also obligations with respect to the heart. And if we look at these three areas, we see that these are three areas that the Prophet ﷺ taught us in the Gabriel hadith. He asked about iman, right? What is faith? The Prophet ﷺ explained faith. And tu'minu billahi wa malaikatihi wa kutubihi, to the end of it, right? Believe in Allah, His angels, His books, wa rusulihi, wa liyawm al-akhiri, wa bil qadri khayri. Mention the pillars of faith. So he taught us about faith. There you have, we're obliged to know things in belief, right? So our belief is sound on the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. That's the first area, personal obligation. Second area he asked, فَأَخْبِرْنِي عَنِ الْإِسْلَامِ, tell me about Islam. And he mentioned the ritual worship, right? Actions that we're obliged to perform for Allah. So that area is Islam. And then he asked about states of the heart, and the Prophet ﷺ answered with yaqeen, right? About certain faith. أخبرني عن الإحسان, tell me about al-ihsan, spiritual excellence or perfection. And ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tarahu, fa in lam takun tarahu, fa innahu yarak, that you worship Allah as if you see him. If you don't see him, he nevertheless sees you. Prophet ﷺ answered about those three areas. And a lot of times our scholars, elementary books, they'll cover our obligations, or some of them, fundamental and initial obligations, primary obligations in those three areas. So we have obligations in Iman. We have to get our Iman sound and right. Know what what we must confirm and affirm about Allah, and what we cannot. And that sounds simple, but right now, that is where the question is, right? Back in the day, I remember, for example, at university, we were worried about boyfriend and girlfriend. One brother took Shahada. We came to Jummah. He had been selling someone some weed. We were worried about, misconduct, right? Misconduct. Now it's faith. Now people have misgivings about the faith itself and fundamental character, right? It's the onslaught of the shaitan is getting deeper. May Allah protect us from that. So what we need for our faith to be sound, for our practice to be valid, and to rid our hearts of forbidden diseases. So that is personally obligatory. Each of us is obliged to pursue at least that much knowledge, and that's what this treatise is for. Basics in those three areas. So we wanted to give this little time, 15 or 20 minutes at Jumu'ah, at the beginning prior to the formal khutbah, to cover some of these obligations that are on all of us. We have people that have embraced Islam. When they embrace Islam, they're obliged to begin learning that. We have kids that are coming of age. We're obliged to teach them that. Once they hit puberty, they're obliged to acquire that knowledge themselves. And then everyone who hasn't acquired it is personally obliged to acquire it. And then the author mentions the hadith, whoever travels a path seeking therein knowledge, Allah will make easy for him a path to Jannah. Or Allah will make him travel a path to Jannah, and in a narration, easy for him, a path to Jannah. So pursuing knowledge is a path to nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his pleasure. And may Allah grant us that. Then the author says, and after to proceed, La ilaha illallah, and I'm using this translation of Essentials of Islam by Abdulaziz Ahmed, and they're available online, and extremely beneficial. So he says, the topics discussed in this book have mainly been abridged, meaning summarized. I've summarized these primarily from the books of the Proof of Islam, Hujjatul Islam, Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, one of our great theologians. And many of you are very familiar with him because we're studying a book by him on Thursdays and Sundays. The author then prays for all of us and gives an indication of how we should benefit from this which he's sharing with us, rahimahullah. So he says, it is our hope from Allah, and the translator actually allowed this to slip from his translation. The author said himself, Narju min Allah, Narju lahu min Allah. And I guess he adds that later. Yeah, it is our hope that whoever knows these questions, right? Whoever knows these topics that he'll discuss, learns every question that he discusses in this book and acts upon them. And that's critical. We just learned from Imam Ghazali the other day, the fruit of knowledge is acting upon it. The whole point of learning is to do what? That you do what you've learned. Right? If we learn how to do salat, the point of learning that is to do salat. Learn about zakat, the point of learning that is to pay zakat, and so on. So he said he hopes from Allah that whoever learns these questions and applies them will be made of the people of knowledge. Allah will make him among the people of knowledge, inwardly and outwardly. And we ask Allah for that. And there's an indication there that Learning and acting as a pathway to inner knowledge, to one's heart, increasing in knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His names, His attributes, the hereafter. Someone might ask, how would I become someone who worships Allah as if I see Him? Essentially, it's this, what he described. Learning what Allah and His Messenger have prescribed for us and recommended us to do, and applying that. Those are medicines and treatments and nurturing for the human soul. And the way to high certainty is nothing other than that. And may Allah grant us that. And Allah says that indicates that in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ. Be mindful of Allah, and Allah teaches you. So knowledge from Allah to the heart of the human being is a fruit of taqwa. It's a fruit of obedience. And then the author says, and it's hard to translate, of great meaning. He says, and success is from Allah, but the word he's using is tawfiq. وَبِاللَّهِ at-tawfiq. Tawfiq is from Allah, and tawfiq with Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is defined as Allah creating in His slave the ability to obey Him. خَلْقَ اللَّهِ قُدْرَةَ الطَّاعَةِ فِي الْعَبْدِ. When Allah creates in a slave the ability to obey. And we can't do any of this without that. What do you call that? The word for that in Arabic is tawfiq. Tawfiq. And it's khalqullah qudratu ta'afil abd. When Allah creates in His slave the ability to obey. And Shu'aib, Allah reveals on His tongue in the Quran, وَمَا تَوْفِيقِي إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. My tawfiq is through none other than Allah, right? My ability to obey only comes from Allah. So the author's indicating then, if he said that we hope that someone who learns this and acts will be from the people of inward and out knowledge, and tawfiq is from Allah, then that indicating, so we ask Allah for tawfiq to obey. We're asking Allah for tawfiq to learn and practice, and we ask Allah that by Allah's mercy, and He's the most merciful of the merciful. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.